everyone. I'm Chelsea Ohlemiller with my Grief and Goodbye series. And tonight I have a grief and empathy activist, the founder of Reimagining Grief, and the podcast host of Grief is a Sneaky Bitch. I have Lisa Keefauver. So welcome. How are you?
I'm good, Chelsea. Thanks so much for having me for this conversation. I know we share a passion about maybe an unusual topic, so I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you tonight and seeing what questions folks have, and just happy to be here.
Yes. Well, and I want to let everybody know that I will put all of Lisa's social media, her website, how to get her podcast, all of the resources she has on her website, all of that will be in the comments section when we wrap up our conversation. So it will be extremely easy to find her. And that's actually how I found Lisa's work, was in my grief work that I do with my webpage. I came across her website and her Instagram, which is just full of hope and inspiration and encouragement. And so I reached out to Lisa and I said, would you want to come on and talk to my followers about grief? And she was so kind to do it. So I really appreciate your time and your commitment to this work.
Oh, absolutely. As I said before, I'm super passionate about this subject that 100% of us experience multiple times in our life. So I always try to say yes to opportunities to keep these conversations going. So,
yeah. So I know you started out as a social worker. Mm-hmm. And so I just want to ask, for those of us, for those watching that may not know, grief isn't something you wake up one day as a 10-year-old kid and say, I'm going to go into the grief world.
I'm a grief and empathy activist when I grow up.
Yes. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about, I know it, but tell us a little bit about your story and kind of what led you here into this space.
Yeah, I certainly didn't ever think I was going to be a grief and empathy activist when I grew up. Not probably one of my dreams, but I always thought I would be somewhere in the mental health space for sure, though I had a little delay, did some research for a while. But as you mentioned, I'm a social worker, and late in my 20s, after a career in research, I was just starting to date who became my husband, now my late husband, Eric, and said, babe, my passion is to be a social worker. So I ended up getting my graduate degree, my MSW. And I spent, a decade or two informally in social work, from everything from foster care and adoption to clinical services. I'm a narrative therapist, public housing. So really traditional work, seeing lots of issues around culture, around society, around financial issues, obviously. And one of the things, just as a prelude to becoming a grief and empathy expert, one of the things that we didn't really talk about, even in systems of care, even in helping systems, was grief. In my graduate education, I didn't have a formal class on grief, which is ridiculous when you think about it, given, as I said, spoiler alert, 100% of us grieve multiple times. But in the work that I was doing, working with people, I mean, think about it: foster care, adoption, housing instability, food insecurity, mental health issues. These are issues that are ripe with grief.
Absolutely.
And around in 2010, I will spare the story, but my husband, who had previously been very healthy, we were half marathon runners, really active. I was 40, he was 44, began acting very strange. We tried jumping through a lot of medical hoops to figure out what was going wrong, which is a conversation for another day about the medical system. And in the end, after a year of not knowing, it turned out that he had a grapefruit-sized brain tumor that had shifted his brain stem. The doctors didn't know how he was talking or walking. And within 17 days, he died in my arms after 2 long, unsuccessful surgeries. And him slipping into a coma. And there I was 40, our daughter was 7, and my previously healthy husband was dead. And I was the clinical director of a big family services. And within 2 weeks, my bosses called me back to work. So we can talk a little bit about work culture. I was a single mom, only person earning money. What else am I going to do? So I went back to work. My daughter went back to school. And I continued in that work, worked in I'm going to just fast forward because we can talk about workplace, but worked in public housing, which also has a lot of grief, intergenerational trauma and loss. Ended up relocating to Texas to found a nonprofit that helps cancer patients and their families. was with a friend when he died in my arms, also in his late 40s, that he died from muscular dystrophy. And what I started recognizing was all the ways in which both the helping professions that I was a part of, all these helping professions, but also all my amazing friends who, whenever I do interviews, I'm always like, shout out to y'all. You did your best. I did my best too, but really didn't know how to show up and offer grief support in a way or talk about it. They were uncomfortable. I was uncomfortable too. I didn't know what to do. I had a health scare of my own, working in and still was in the nonprofit space. Because I'd done a lot of work, public speaking and a lot of TV and media, because I had launched a nonprofit and was trying to do some outreach and have been a writer, I thought, I can't have all this personal and professional experiences with grief and loss and be a speaker and a writer and not do something about it. Mm-hmm. So that was sort of a long answer to say there was just this deep interest always in holding space and bearing witness, in making visible things that our culture make difficult. We pathologize things a lot. But then I had all these really personal experiences with grief. So those things came together and had me founding Reimagining Grief, which I can tell you a little bit about later. I do a lot of different work with individuals and companies. I launched a line of empathy cards.
Yes, I saw those.
Very frustrated. We can talk about that with the language that's available to people for showing up. And then I launched my podcast, Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, as you mentioned, because like this platform that you're providing, I really wanted to create a space where I modeled authentic, vulnerable conversations about grief in its most expansive form, which I'm happy to share my definition of grief. So I'm having people on topics, much bigger than death loss, because of course we can grieve lots of things. And that podcast really seemed to kind of hit a nerve for people and has really taken off and has given me the opportunity to have even bigger, conversations and more conversations. I'm steeped into season 3, and it's just been it's a blessing. I always joke, like, yes, I love talking about grief and loss and I teach grief and loss class for social workers at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm the person who could talk about this topic all the time, and I'm fun at a party. That's what I was like, yeah. Caveat.
Yep.
Because I'll say, and then I'm going to shut up.
No, this is for you. This is your time.
I think the thing that is particularly interesting to me is I think we all want to avoid grief for lots of reasons, which we could get into. I mean, our culture is just so grief illiterate and grief avoidant. We're not taught how to sit with our emotions mindfully. But, I just think it's really important that we show up and bear witness for each other's grief. And when we do that, this has been my experience, kind of doing my own grief work, as I call it, kind of like attending to my own grief. I actually think the people who really face something hard and do the work, the emotional work, spiritual work of moving through that, I don't mean moving on because I don't believe in that, I think have a capacity to find joy and delight and amazement in the everyday life in some ways more than people who haven't faced some hard thing that's happened in our life. Now, just having a hard thing happen doesn't all of a sudden make you like see the joy in the world. I think it takes kind of, as one of my guests once said, sitting in the suck for a while and really working through your, emotional, whatever has happened to you. But I really do delight in things a lot more than I ever did even before, let's say, my husband passed away. Yeah. And I was already a pretty glass half full kind of person, previous to that. So yes, I love talking about this topic. And yes, I'm fun at a party.
Yes, I love that. And, the two things you reminded me of, the author of The Beauty of What Remains, Rabbi Steve Leder. He was on this summer. Mm-hmm. And he said, a lot of times when you talked about people showing up for you. Yeah. And he said, what happens is people don't show up as their authentic selves anymore. Mm-hmm. They show up as these people that are like, something different. And really what a grieving heart needs is just, if you're the life of the party, show up and be that same funny person. Yeah. Or if you're the person that's always, cleaning up and, helping like a mother hen would do that, or whatever it is, show up as your authentic self and keep helping people.
Yeah.
And so that always was very, I've remembered that since he said it, because not only do you need people to show up, but you need people to show up as their authentic self. So you don't feel, if they're putting on
you
a
have
show,
to take care of them.
You have to put on a show, and we don't have the energy to do that.
Yeah, so interesting. So holding space and bearing witness practices was actually my graduate thesis back long before I, knew that was going to be relevant to the work that I'm doing in grief. That actually comes from a trauma I experienced as a teen, which is a story for another podcast. And the helper providers and the people in my life didn't really know how to hold space and bear witness for my pain. So I'm particularly interested in this practice of how we show up. And part of the challenge, I think what you were alluding to there, is that we aren't taught how to show up for our own pain.
Oh, yes.
So if we can't show up for our own pain, how are we going to show up for the pain of others? Particularly because we live in a culture that believes everything is a problem that has a solution, that grief or any emotion other than happiness is a problem that needs fixing.
Yep.
And then that puts the onus on grief supporters to feel like it's my job to go fix the griever. So my invitation right from the get-go, and part of all the work that I do, my empathy cards and on my podcast, on my Instagram, as you said, I'm always trying to offer these little sort of nuggets to people, which is set down your expectation. Your job is not to fix the griever. Yep. They don't need fixing. And even if they did, you couldn't do it.
Yep.
What you can do to help a griever is show up, shut up, listen, and keep showing up.
Yep.
Because, by the way, it's not done after the funeral or the memorial or the 1-year anniversary. So how are you checking in? And that holding spaces you were alluding to, or like showing up as if you're the cleaner, like offer to clean, or if you're the whatever you are, be your authentic self. Because the truth is, grief is probably the most isolating experience that we have. We feel disconnected from ourselves, and we just feel disconnected from the world. And so really, when you can show up as your authentic self, even if you don't say a word. One of my best grief support moments from a friend after my husband died, she spent like 2 hours with me. She didn't say a word. It was the most impactful thing I experienced.
Yep.
Is show up, ditch your own grief beliefs and energy at the door, and be present and hold space. You are a vessel to basically remind and care for and nurture and help be a sort of path back to a community of belonging. It's not going to get wrapped up in a neat little, like, oh, I came and I sat with you for an hour and now you feel like you belong back in the world. But really our job is to keep bringing that connection, to keep saying, I see you.
Absolutely.
I hear you. I'm holding you in my heart. Your pain is valid. Your rage is valid. Your numbness is valid. Your sorrow is valid, whatever it is. We don't have to fix it. And the biggest mistake we make as grief supporters, and by the way, I still screw this up too, even though I do this for
I do too. I still do.
Especially like I do it with my daughter, because the whole parental thing, we really think we have to fix there too.
Right.
It's hard to see the people we love in pain. But when you go into fix, or you make it about you, and then the griever is trying to attend to you.
Yep.
Instead of it being that direction. I always remind people, grief support is in concentric circles. So the primary griever gets to rely on the people outside. And if you're going into give grief support, you probably need it too, because maybe you knew the person, or it was hard to bear witness to the griever, but you don't go in on the circle. You go out. Out.
That's a great way to look at it. Yeah.
It's so I'm thinking my friends came and showed up for me, and that was amazing, but they also were friends with Eric.
Right.
And they loved Eric. So they needed to go to
they gotta go back. Friends. Yeah. Back in the circle.
And then, kind of outward. It's not always so neat. Sometimes the circles are a little messy, and even in those instances, when they're going to their friends, they don't need their friends to fix them. They need their friends to hold space and bear witness to their pain, to honor whatever their struggle is.
Yeah.
So anyway,
So no, I want to actually go. First, I want to say that comments are coming in, and we're going to get to all these.
Everybody.
Lisa, Carolyn, Maria,
Chantilly. I love that name.
Yes, that's beautiful. Candace. So I'm going to get to these in a minute, but you reminded me of something. And so I want to get a little bit more specific about what you just said, because as you know, we're in a holiday week. So, we've got Thanksgiving that's going to be happening, and get-togethers that are going to be happening. And so let's dive a little deeper into that. So we're going to be surrounded by people, or a lot of people are, or some are going to choose to stay at home. So,
which, by the way, perfectly acceptable choice if that's what you want to do.
Absolutely.
As Tabitha Brown says, that's your business.
Yes, it's your choice. Absolutely. And I said a lot of times, people ask me for I'm not a grieving expert. I just have grief experience. And so people will say, what should I do? And I say, whatever brings you joy and peace, whatever brings you stress, say no if you have to this year. But what are you going to, what advice do you have for both the person that's going to walk into that Thanksgiving get together or this holiday get together and be a grieving heart? And how do they show up? What are the best ways to, if they've decided to show up, what are the best ways to go into this? And also if there's, people sitting there, watching the griever, how do they comfort them? So it's kind of a twofold question, but, we're really into this holiday season. And so I didn't know if you could give more specific to that. And I'll look at all these comments.
I see that question. Lisa was sharing that this is her first grieving holiday, and I'm holding you in my heart, Lisa. And Chantilly's boundaries are important for grieving and for life. I agree with that, Chantilly, for sure.
Absolutely.
So I think I might first kind of speak to the griever in mind.
Yes.
Your first grief, or, first, holiday or activity, or down the road, by the way, because it's sometimes the seconds suck worse than the firsts. That happens sometimes. Is you don't owe anybody it's not your responsibility to take care of other people. Your emotions and your pain and their discomfort with your emotions is not your problem. That's their problem. And I'm saying they to whoever that they is, the sister, the uncle, the brother, the cousin, whoever, whom, by the way, might also be grieving too. So I first want to just say to the griever, whatever you're experiencing is okay. It's painful. It might feel hard and difficult, but the degree to which you have already agreed to go somewhere, which I might reverse and say, also, it's okay to say not ready, or I'm only coming for an hour, have an exit strategy. I always encourage people to have an exit strategy. Do you have your exit buddy? I'm sorry, I'm just thinking movies. But remember that I think we're so taught that other people's emotions are more important than ours, that we have some responsibility to make nice and make everything okay and perform into our okayness, just generally, not just with grief, but we kind of have that culture. And this is your grief. So I just say first, self-compassion. And listen inward. What do you really need? And it's okay if the answer is, I don't know. One minute, I feel like I really want to be around my family. And the next minute, I don't know. That's a perfectly valid answer. And you might find a trusted family member in the group of folks that you're visiting to say, one minute, I really want to be there. And the next minute, I don't, and have a plan with them. But I think it starts first, before you kind of engage anybody else, I think it starts first with giving yourself permission to grieve, to not know, to feel conflicted about what you want to do. I think that's the first place to start, and keep returning to that self-compassion. You've never grieved this loss before and faced this gathering before. How would you know what to do? Can you just give yourself some permission to be I'm just figuring this out? So that's my first message to the griever. If we're talking about actually going somewhere and what can the griever do? Again, I would say if there's a trusted confidant in the group of folks that you're visiting, tell them ahead of time kind of what your concerns are. Have an exit strategy. Maybe don't get a ride with somebody if you need to, do a quick exit, from the party. And I also think just give yourself some permission if you need to go to the bathroom and cry, or you want to cry in the living room, just keep remembering that it's not you. As far as preparing other people in the space, that of course is so unique to the loss and to the circumstances of the family maybe that you're visiting. So I think one thing is just, if you have those trusted family members, if you know for sure, I don't want to talk about it, or for sure, I do want to talk about it, I want to have a ritual, I want to bring them up, then find a way, again, like a buddy, if you don't feel confident saying that, to help you prepare people ahead of time, right? Like, if it was me, I would say, when we go around and say our Thanksgiving, if that's a tradition as an example, I want everybody to say something about Eric, or I don't want anybody to say something about Eric. That's okay too, but just the degree to which and it's okay, it's messy. If you don't know, do not beat yourself up.
Right.
But sort of do that. So find a buddy, sort of prepare, and also best laid plans also get thrown out the window. So you might think you want to go around the table, and then it turns out you don't. I can tell you, I have cried at many a gathering.
Same.
Many a gathering. And not just at a holiday thing, kind of like a Sunday brunch series that we used to be a part of with some extended family members and friends. And then it was just, them and me. And so they knew Eric too, as an example. And sometimes it was 2 years later or 3 years later, and just something happened about somebody said. And one of the things I've learned to do is to not apologize.
Yes.
Which is hard. We want to make everybody else feel comfortable. So I'm still kind of speaking directly to the griever. Sorry, but
no, I agree, because that guilt, like, people have to realize, like, you're grieving. So really that takes all your space and
energy.
That's
where your energy is.
Right. So you cannot hold guilt for how things are going to go or how other people are going to feel. You cannot feel shame. So many people, like you said,
and we do
apologize.
We might talk about mindfulness later, and people will feel shame, and people will feel guilt, and people have this little friend in their head, actually enemy, just kidding, called should. And we have a lot of shoulds, especially around our grief. So I would just say there's a piece of that. And I just saw that Lisa mentioned this, and we might talk about it later too, but particularly when you're early in your grief is not just an emotional reaction. It's a stress response. We have cognitive impairment. We have physiological, sometimes immunology impairment. Of course, it impacts our finance and everything. So you might not even feel clear about what you want, or you might get there and not really understand what's going on. So that's one piece. Related to the griever, before we get on to the grief supporter, I want to say, I see folks one-on-one. I do grief support. And of course, I'm always talking with people on my platforms and education. And everybody's always like, well, what should I do about the rituals? I do or don't. Do I have to create a new ritual? What do I want to do? And people put so much, and I understand that too. I mean, Eric died in August, and I remember that first Christmas, Lily, had just turned 8, and I was like, do we do a tree? Don't we do a tree? I really don't want to do an effing tree. Am I going to screw her up for life if I don't do a tree? And,
Yep.
And I would say, like everything else, there's no one right answer.
Yep.
If you feel like on December, if you celebrate, I'm just saying that for Christmas, but you might celebrate Hanukkah or Kwanzaa or some others, but whatever your traditions are, I think, again, we feel so much pressure, like we should carry on the tradition, or I don't want to, but now I feel guilty that I don't want to. And I guess my invitation is, again, it's going to be a broken record tonight. Have some compassion for yourself, and don't get hooked on this idea that the first thing I do, especially the first year, is always going to be the way I have to do it. So I have to get it right now. You don't. You just have to, what's the next best thing? And if this year, not going to a holiday gathering, or going to a holiday gathering, or doing your rituals that you used to do, or creating a new ritual, those are all good answers.
Yes. And there's no way. I saw somebody say, am I doing this the right way? Or, am I grieving properly? There is no right way. There's no proper way. There's no normal way. Yeah.
I mean, I agree. My grief has ebbed and flowed and looked different over these last 10 plus years since my husband died. My grief over my friend Joe has changed over time. Grief over my trauma and loss that has changed over time. Grief over my rescue dog who died last year has changed over time. And my grief for each of those people, and pets has looked different. And my grief looks different, by the way, than everybody else's in the room who also knew those people or those pets. So there's no one right way, which is why I always keep coming back to that self-compassion. We have to listen in mindfully to that judgment. I think the challenge with this is, especially as of the folks who are watching are maybe going to be showing up at gatherings with family or friends, is even though there is no one right way to grieve, I can guarantee 1 to 25 people in your life are going to tell you that you're grieving right, that you're grieving wrong, that they know somebody who lost somebody who grieved like this. And therapy was the right thing for them. You should do therapy. And you're going to have a lot of people having a lot of opinions on how you're grieving. And between you and me, you can tell them all to, you know what, I won't swear. You can tell them that from me. But it's hard for us to not buy into that.
Right.
Right? We're like, oh, well, they, somebody I trust said that, or my dad said that, or my sister said that, or somebody said that. They must know, so I must be doing it wrong. And if you get nothing else from our conversation today, I want to look right in my eyes and saying, you are grieving exactly how you need to grieve. You are feeling how you need to feel. It won't feel like this forever, even though I know it feels like it will right now. But there's no right way. And I think the more you can offer yourself that kind of daily mantra, hourly, minutely mantra, that's an important tool as you show up for these gatherings, because even though it's mostly, I will say 95% well-intentioned by other people, there might be 5% of people with attitude. People are going to have opinions, and some of them might have some good suggestions. I'm not saying that they won't, but they're going to have opinions. And I want you to remember, only you know how to navigate this journey.
Absolutely.
And you don't have to have it figured all out. I always say, like, think about, people are always like, I have to have it figured out. Like, if you were going to go, you're not going to pack for a year on a trip, right? You're going to like, what can I do for the next 7 days? What am I going to pack in my toolkit or my suitcase for the next 7 days? So you might not have to figure out, how am I going to navigate this grief forever? You might be thinking right now as we approach holidays, like, what are the things that I know that I need to help me? And you might have time compartments, by the way, of minutes, and then it might be days and it might be hours, but you don't have to figure it all out. You just have to keep checking inward and listening. Am I going or not going? Am I sitting at the dinner table and not sitting at the dinner table, or whatever, because I feel like I should, or because this is actually serving me? And if the answer is it's actually serving you, great. If the answer is I feel like I'm doing it because I should, can you find that trusted person to say, I got to peace out. This is not working.
This isn't working for me.
That was a lot to the griever. I don't know if you want to pause, but I have some thoughts for the folks who are like the grief supporters or the other people in the family.
Yeah, no, go for it. And I think, because that's the problem. I think that, like you mentioned at the beginning, is just, we weren't really taught, like, grief is forever. It's not this, fancy little circle. Yeah. It's not this thing that you get over, and so like you said, even in your training for working with people, you didn't have this grief, training or this grief knowledge.
Yeah.
And so these people that, we're going to show up and we're going to be messy and we're going to be complicated and we're going to be emotional. And so what can they do?
Yeah.
How can they support us?
Well, I want to add that it's not just that we didn't learn grief. We really culturally, and I'm just kind of speaking writ large, United States, kind of Western culture.
Yeah.
I mean, we weren't taught how to really sit with and experience any of our emotions, really. Like, our capacity to withstand any emotions or challenges is just not something we're really taught. Most of us in our families, we're definitely not taught it in our school systems. Mm-hmm. So there's that. Plus then we're taught these, I always call it our grief miseducation, because we're taught, it's linear, it's stages, it's like a top 10 list that you just check off and you get through, and that it has to look incrementally better, as time goes on, and then you get over it. Or, I remember people like, oh, you'll find love again, and then you'll be fine, as if somehow, even if I did fall in love again, I was not going to still grieve my husband, right? So I think we have that grief miseducation on top of the fact that we have this lack of education around our capacity to navigate our own emotional world. So that's kind of a double whammy.
Yep.
that same culture that teaches us a grief miseducation is based on this broader culture, which is what often affects grief supporters showing up and trying to give you their unsolicited advice, trying to fix you, being uncomfortable around your pain. They too grew up in the same miseducation system. So it's sort of it's kind of like a double whammy that's happening right there. So if you're a grief supporter, that's trying to show up, or somebody in the family, first of all, I always invite people, I do this with my students too. What are your grief beliefs? So if you know you're going to a gathering with someone who's grieving, check in first with your own grief beliefs. Do you actually harbor this belief that they should be over it by now, or that there should be better, or some kind of grief, or you're not allowed to grieve this kind of loss, etc.? So check your own grief beliefs. And if there are any of those things, any of those flavors, set them down at the door. You can pick them. I mean, don't pick them back up, but if you need to, pick them back up on your way out the door. So the second is kind of returning to what I just said, is your job is not to fix the grief support or griever. Your job is to make space for them. So one thing is maybe again, this is broad advice because I don't know the dynamics, but if this is someone you know or you love or you're close to, you might check in with them beforehand. Hey, I know we're getting together at Aunt Suzette's house, and I'm wondering whether it's important for you to share memories of so-and-so. Do you want me to ask about it, or would you rather not? And it's okay if that changes, but I want to make sure I'm trying to show up the best way I can. So if you have a relationship with that person, you might check in with them before, and also be fine if they don't answer you back, because sometimes we don't want to do the work of taking care of other people. But that's, again, depending on your relationship, it might be nice to check in.
Yeah.
And then I think the other thing is I think where grief supporters go off the rails is when they get in their own head that they have some kind of control and that they have to fix or make okay everything for the griever. And just like we were talking about before, really, it's your energy is going to impact somebody else's energy. So if you can, besides setting down those bad grief beliefs from your miseducation at the door, if you can set down the assumption that your job is there to fix or to be the bumpers on the side of the bowling lane, just like your job is not to fix or correct the griever, is to just bear witness. So if the griever is chit-chatting about whatever, and it seems like they're kind of light and whatever, then go along with the light conversations that they're having. If the griever is crying in the corner, depending again on your relationship, you might walk up and say, I can imagine this is a really hard time. Would you like somebody to just sit next to you? We don't even have to talk. I could be here. Mm-hmm. We have this myth that we have to come and say the right thing. And usually, and most of the things people say
are wrong.
The way I create
they hurt, they sting, and they don't know that it stings,
So that's what I always like that. Like I said, one of my favorite experiences was someone coming in, just sitting down on the floor next to me, because I couldn't even make it to the couch because I was so upset. And she just sat in silence with me, and I eventually talked, but she would have sat there if I didn't. I cried. She just held me, kind of sat next to me. Again, of course, it always depends on the relationship. But really, it's less about saying the right thing or doing the right thing. It's absolutely not about fixing the person. It's really about holding space, setting your energy aside so that you can be in tune with that person, showing up as your authentic self. If you're the funny sister, again, depends how early it is. Funny might not be appropriate, but you might make cracks at some other family member, or ask them hey, do you want me to be my funny self today? Or what can I do? How can I support you?
Yeah.
Remembering that the griever might not have the answer. It might be different to different family members or change over the course of the evening. Mm-hmm. So those are kind of some broad ideas I would share. I mean, I'm happy to answer specific questions, but it really does depend on the circumstance. So the bigger issue is just being in tune and attending to the griever. You don't need to hover over them, but you also don't necessarily want to ignore them. You guys might decide in your family that there's one person they're very close with. So you might have a point person who is that person's buddy to check in every once in a while.
Yeah.
One last thing I'll say that I think is a big myth And with everything I share, everything's a caveat. So your folks who are joining us, Susan and Suzanne and Maria and all the lovely folks who are joining us might feel differently at this stage in their grief. But I think one of the biggest myths that I've encountered in my work and in my personal grief is that people don't talk about your person if it's a death loss. By the way, because we could talk about that, but we grieve lots of things beyond death loss.
Absolutely.
But if we're talking about death loss, people often don't bring up the person's name because they think it's going to make the griever upset, which if I can just, again, look directly in the camera, that is the biggest bunch of hooey. We're thinking about the person. So you not bringing up the person just reminds us, makes us feel that we're the only one whose job it is to carry their memory forward.
Yep. That everybody else is forgetting.
And that everybody else is forgetting. Mm-hmm. So again, it depends. Sometimes, there are circumstances where you don't want somebody to bring it up. I'm legit that can be. But for the most part, we want to talk about them. We want to hear your favorite funny stories of that person, or your sad stories, or your sassy stories, or whatever. We want you to be interested. If we're just meeting you for the first time, you're the new boyfriend at the family gathering. I want you to ask me, so what was Eric like? What was a favorite quality of his, that you love? What would I love about him? Or what was a funny thing he used to do? Or, something like that. So I think ditching this myth that we shouldn't bring them up is probably, like, if I'm speaking to the grief supporter, is probably one of the biggest things. Eric was our memory keeper. So one of the cruel things about time and grief is that he's literally the person I would go to ask, well, what was that place we went to? Or what was that? You know what I mean? So the more other people tell stories or, remember, I'm about to go on a trip with some of my family members going scuba diving, which was something that he and I shared. I'm going to be bringing some of his ashes, and this particular constellation of my family knows that we're going to sit around and tell Eric stories.
Oh, I love that.
You know what I mean? And they're going to be a part of keeping his memory forward. But I've definitely been on gatherings where, people, I have a stepsister one time, she's so lovely. She loved Eric too. And we were in a beautiful place about 5 or 6 years after Eric died over holidays. And she was really sad. I could see her kind of crying. And I said, "What's wrong?" And she just looked at me and she said, "Eric would have loved this place, but I didn't want to say anything because I didn't want to upset you." And I said, which was so sweet. And I said, "Oh my God, I was sitting up on this balcony thinking the exact same thing. So thank you for saying something." And then we proceeded to talk about how he would have taken advantage of the trip much better than the rest of us, because that's how he rolled.
I love that. Well, and that's kind of, what you said, like, you're going to go and you're going to tell his stories, and that's, you've made it known that that's what you're going to do. And I love that Susan said, she set the table for her husband, and that it's been 19 months. And I think that's a beautiful, beautiful thing.
Yeah. And playful is the wrong word, because it doesn't sound like a playful time, but just be open to experimentation. Maybe the first time Susan went to set the table, she wasn't sure if that was what she wanted or if other people are going to be upset. And then you're going to just kind of find your way and figure out your way. I wasn't articulate with my family members about telling Eric stories in the beginning because I didn't quite know what I didn't know or what I needed. Absolutely. So just being open to the fact that you're going to kind of stumble over what it is you need, what you're looking for in terms of gestures, actions, words, stories. And that you're going to kind of discover that over time. And also, as I said, that maybe what you need in the first year isn't what you need in the 5th year. Isn't
or even the 5th month.
Or the 5th month. Yeah. I mean, but as far as like grief supporters, that might change over time too. And that's okay. Giving yourself permission that your relationship with your grief is going to change over time, which means your relationship with the people who are trying to show up and support you is going to change over time too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think, speaking to the myths, I absolutely agree with all of the myths that you've spoken about tonight. And I also feel like the myth that was told to me the most is like the first year is the hardest. The first year is the hardest. And for me, it was actually the second year was extremely harder than the first. Yeah. And I know friends that year 3 was the hardest, Yeah. And each year brings new things that I'm grieving. When I had my child and my mother wasn't there, that was a different grief.
All the milestones. Yeah.
Yes. And so if you find, that you're in your 5th year of Christmases without your mother or your spouse or whatever, and you're feeling it differently and heavier than you ever have before. I just want to say
That's
how
okay.
common, and that is okay. You know, I had several people this week, you know, email me. I think, like I told you before we started our conversation, and just say, you know, is this normal? Is this okay? And I'm always like, there is no normal.
That's my number one
common,
thing that I do. I
no
feel like in my podcast and my one-on-one work, because we pathologize grief so much in our culture, which we really do, and really pathologize, again, any emotion that's not happy, because we live in a toxic positivity kind of culture. I think grief is hard because it's hard, because we had a story, we had a relationship, we had a loved one, and it's gone, right? So it's hard. I'm not negating that. But part of what I think makes grief so much harder is that we are so grief avoidant and illiterate. And so we spend so much time internally wrestling with the shoulds of grief. I should feel better. I shouldn't feel better. I remember the first time I laughed, and then I felt so crappy because I laughed, and I didn't know that you could laugh, you know, again, you know, because nobody talked about it. And so I think, again, if you're a griever and you're listening to me right now, listen to this. But if you're a grief supporter, this might be something you think about. You can offer a griever, which is really just to normalize whatever they're experiencing. You hate the world right now. I can imagine you do, because this is a horrible thing that happened to you. You just want to crawl in your bed and just sleep for the next 15 hours. I can imagine that you want to do that. You don't feel like talking about them tonight, and you just want to have a good time. That's okay too. Like, just really normalizing the fact that there is no normal. This myth of normal is just, I think, toxic. I really think it's toxic for us.
Yeah.
So how I try to flip that on its end is just like, pretty much whatever you tell me, I'm going to say, that's normal. That's okay.
Yes.
You know, and, you know, I might be jumping ahead, but one thing I want to say is, you're right that it is quite common that year 2 or year 3 is harder, in part because, thank goodness, our nervous system, our beautiful human body, brain, soul connections do this thing called numbness. This is this beautiful nervous system response that we go to when something horrible happens and we're stressed. And so in some ways, the first year is hard and difficult and horrendous. I'm not saying it's not, but we're still kind of numb and finding our way. And then year 2 sometimes is like the numbness has worn off, and then it's like we're further away from that time and it feels hard. So if your year 2 was easier than year 1, great. If your year 2 is harder than your year 1, that's okay too. There's so many variables each of us face based on milestones. You know, I mean, I just sent my daughter off to college and bawled like a baby, because there we were dropping her off on campus, and Eric should have been there in all the regalia, totally embarrassing the absolute hell out of her, which he would have. And he wasn't, you know, and I bawled like a baby on campus, and this is 10 years. So I think it's okay to just normalize. Anytime you listen to that inner monologue and you're hearing the word should, I often have my one-on-one clients do this as an activity. That's an invitation to pause and kind of hold your grieving self like you would a little kid that skinned its knee. And just like wrap yourself in loving, like, yeah, you're struggling, or yeah, you're angry, or yeah, you're hard, or yeah, it's hard. And just ditch that should and just be compassionate with wherever you're at. Like, wherever you're at in that moment is wherever you need to be. You're not going to stay there, because that's the thing that we need to remember about our emotional life is no emotions stay. Not the good ones. I don't really believe in good and bad emotions. Emotions are actually just information. But the hard ones aren't going to stay. The ones we want to stay, like joy and delight, aren't going to stay either. So holding space and bearing witness for your own hard pain and wherever you're at in your grief in that moment is the best gift you can give yourself, is to self-compassionately like nurture and attend to whatever you're experiencing in that moment.
Yes. Oh my gosh, that's so beautiful.
Yeah.
So, Well, we have already went way over time, and so I hope you are okay with time.
Yeah, I'm okay, but
okay, good.
So keep running, yeah, for sure.
I was like, oh my gosh, it's so easy to talk to you. So I looked at the time and I thought, oh my gosh. If anybody has questions that we have not gotten to yet, please put those in there. We'll try
to look on the side while also looking at you.
I know it's really hard. A lot of times they pop up. So I see Susan writing and Paula and Chantilly. So if you guys have any questions, go ahead and drop those in there right now. I'm going to skim through and make sure we didn't.
Susan agreed. She felt guilty if she laughed. Yeah. I mean, this is the thing. We are just complex, beautiful, full emotion landscape human beings. And wherever we get to, whatever place we're in is okay. So whether it's laughter or whether it's sadness or whether, I'm just going to admit some things to y'all if it makes you feel better. I remember first of all, not understanding how planes were still flying and cars were still driving. That was in the beginning. I was like, I don't understand how the world is still going. But I remember being at places with happy looking couples and just being pissed.
Yep.
Just angry, this is not fair. My husband should be here. And I didn't even know these people. I mean, I didn't act out on it, of course, but I just remember feeling angry.
I was like that with my mom when I
saw and just or my friends, especially after time went on, they would be complaining to me about their husband doing something annoying. And I was like, well, I wish my husband was around to do something annoying,
Yeah.
But I also remember, I will share this story. I remember laughing for the first time. I'm going to say it was 8 months in or something after my husband died. I wasn't sleeping. I was up a lot at night. And my friend Joe, who then died in my arms also 5 years later, used to stay up late and text with me. And I was watching Jon Stewart on my laptop back then, The Daily Show. It was how old it was. And texting with him. And Jon Stewart could always crack me up. And he said something funny. And I laughed out loud. It was 2 a.m. And noticed I laughed and then immediately just started beating myself up for laughing. I shouldn't be laughing. My husband's dead at this, I had all kinds of stories immediately were flying in my head about and thankfully in texting with Joe and talking with some friends the next day, I was able to kind of come around to no, that's okay. And I took a mental snapshot of that feeling. What did it feel like in my body to laugh? What did it feel like? And I tell this to my clients all the time. Be a joy, and joy is sometimes a strong word in early grief. I would say be a not devastated detective, right? So take these snapshots of these embodied experiences that are maybe the times when things suck less. I mean, you might reach for joy, but you might also just reach for the moments where things suck less. Mm-hmm. And take a snapshot of that, because you want to start to sort of put that in your toolkit or in your memory bank so that next time you kind of end up in the dip of your grief, you can remember, oh, there was a time, even if it was just for 5 minutes, that it didn't feel like this.
Yes.
And the more we can take these mental snapshots of the truth of grief, which by the way is not, this, and it's not this, it's, sometimes in the beginning, it's just a lot like this. And then you have little blips but every time you gather those snapshots of those other ways of feeling and being, it's like a resource for you to kind of hold on to when you dip back again. And it feels like you've always been here. Because that's the thing about sadness, anger, guilt, shame. They're tricky. And they make you feel like they've always been here and they're always going to be here. They're kind of sneaky little efforts, right?
Yeah.
And having that mental snapshots that you've begun to collect are so important, because they can kind of talk back to the weight of whatever the hard emotion is in that moment. So that's just something to think about, whatever emotions are coming. I see a lot of comments flying.
I know. Yeah. Well, I like that Lisa, she said, I expect people to know when I'm angry or sad, but they don't know. And I struggled with that a lot too, is I am so sad. Why does nobody understand?
Why is nobody checking in? Or why are you talking to me about the weather? I don't care. The weather.
And I really had to learn, and I don't know, especially with my husband or my kids or, family members, but I learned to just be I'm really sad right now. Sometimes I'll even say, I don't know why. I do know why, but I'll say, I'm really sad right now. Like, I just need you to know that, like, you're talking to me and I'm not really listening, or I can't get past this because right now I'm sad. Or, there have been times where, my sister and I'll say, I'm really mad. I am mad. She should be here, like, she is not here for the birth of my nephew or my child, and, there are times where I have to tell them because I can't do whatever everybody else is doing until I call out that. And so I think that's just part of it, is oftentimes we expect people to know.
Which, again, have compassion for yourself. Don't use this as an opportunity to beat yourself up that you didn't know that to communicate it. It's okay. We've never been here before. But it is, people can't always read our interior mind. And so, again, depending on the person and who you feel safe with, you might figure out how to just say, like, I'm sad and I really don't want you to do anything about it, or I'm sad and here's what I need, if you know what they need. Yep. I wanted to respond to something Susan said, which was she's constantly talking about her hubby with her daughter, and sometimes she forgets that she lost her dad. And I definitely experienced that a lot. Different people get different attention based on the loss and the age, et cetera. I would just say to Susan, like, again, I'm a broken record, compassion for yourself. You've never lost your husband before, so how would you know to do it? And there are times where it's appropriate for us to talk with our kids, depending on their ages, about our own experiences, making space for their grief too. Sometimes we need to find people outside of their circle, to talk to, but to just be kind to yourself about that. One thing I say, which is, I'm going to throw a scuba dive metaphor in here, stay with me, but I'm a scuba diver, is I think it's important for us to talk with family members. And as we approach these holiday gatherings, there can be some benefit to being in a room full of people who also experience that loss, because, again, you don't have to necessarily explain yourself. They are experiencing a loss too. You might be able to share stories and memories, and that's lovely. But sometimes the people closest to us have the hardest time showing up for us. Mm-hmm. And it's not because they are not caring people. It's because they love us so much. They have such a hard time seeing us in pain, and they can't resist the urge to try to fix us because they love us so much. Yep. So it's why I think grief support, whether it's like with a grief guide like me, or a grief support group, or listening to a podcast, or finding people outside of the primary grief, can be really helpful, because, and I think specifically finding a grief guide or mental health provider, and this is where the scuba metaphor comes in, is those of us who've been trained know how to help you. There's this thing in scuba diving called buddy breathing. And when you go underwater, sometimes when you run out of air, you have a buddy who helps you breathe with their regulator. And people who've been trained are sort of trained to help you buddy breathe when you run out of air. And they don't have the same relationship with you, right, where they want to take care of you or fix you. They can just, I don't need you to answer. I'm just going to help you breathe. I'm just going to help you get through this moment.
Oh my gosh. That's a great way to visualize it. And there's a lot of people like Bree and a couple of others that it's just the first year without people, mothers and family members. And so,
again, compassionate, kindness, have a plan, have a buddy, have an exit strategy from the party or the gathering, wherever you're going. Find somebody who you feel, if instead of trying to explain what you need to all 30 people, maybe find one person who you feel like you can tell, and they can tell the group, so-and-so does or doesn't want us to do this, or this, so that you're not having to tell it to everybody. Yeah. Kathleen asked, how do I balance my emotions and anger, especially on holidays around family? Again, everything is unique and individual to people's loss experience, but mindfulness practices have been so integral to how I've navigated my own grief and how I help other people do that as well. And that mindfulness practices often helps us do some of that regulation of our emotions, getting in touch with our emotions, discharging our stress. So I think using mindfulness practices, certainly. I think the other thing, particularly around anger when it comes to family and the holidays and grief, is sometimes we're angry because we've said yes to things that we're not ready for.
Oh, yep.
or as somebody said earlier on in our conversation, we didn't draw a boundary or someone has crossed our boundary. So one thing I would say is, to the degree that you can get clear about what you do or don't need and give yourself permission that that'll change over time, and the degree that you can communicate that to people, which might include, by the way, saying, no, I'm not coming, or I'm only coming for part of it, or I'm, whatever, that can help regulate your emotions because you're not being pulled or triggered by some things that you weren't ready to handle. So that's just one way to think about it. But mindfulness practices is definitely something that has been critical to how I've navigated the sort of wide range of emotions. And I use it as part of my work with clients daily. I mean, that's a part of the daily work that I do.
Yes. And I want to remind everybody that I will put all of Lisa's social media accounts and her website, and also a couple of her YouTube videos, because she does a mindfulness practice on.
I need to record more. I have a monthly group that I've been running, which I'm pausing for December and January. But if also later on, if folks want to join a group, they can do that. But I did record some, and I need to record some more so folks have them. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, your website is just full of resources for grieving individuals. If we did not get to your comment tonight, I promise you, we will go back in after this, after it airs. We will go in tonight and tomorrow and make sure to respond to all of you if we did not get to you. But I do want to just thank everybody who tuned in. It's so great to see the interaction and just know that you guys are here and supporting, the work that we do, which is all for all of you guys. And I really just want to thank you, Lisa. I am so honored to have you. And I just really am appreciative of your time and your knowledge and your willingness to share your story, because it's not always easy.
It's not always easy, but 100% of us grieve. And I think if we can, I love opportunities like these, as I said at the beginning, because I think the more normal we can make grief, the easier it will be for all of us to navigate it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for having me. And thanks everybody for joining. I really appreciate you. And remember, be compassionate to yourself over the holidays. Okay.
Absolutely. So thank you, everybody. And like I said before, we'll get to your comments, and thank you for tuning in. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye.